In the late spring of 1945, deep within the freezing terrain of the Bavarian Alps, a high-ranking military officer deliberately buried 52 steel drums packed with microfilm before walking down the mountain to surrender to American forces. This man was not treated as a captured enemy, nor was he marched into a prisoner of war camp to await trial for his substantial role in the bloodiest conflict in human history. Instead, he was quietly separated from the regular prisoners, placed in a custom-tailored American uniform, and flown secretly to Washington for top-level meetings at the Pentagon. The staggering reality of this arrangement remained completely hidden from the public, who were simultaneously being told that the Allies were relentlessly hunting down the architects of the Nazi regime to face justice at Nuremberg. The man walking the halls of American power was Major General Reinhard Gehlen, Adolf Hitler's chief intelligence officer for the Eastern Front, and he had brought with him an offer that the United States government ultimately decided was simply too valuable to refuse. You are left to wonder what kind of information could possibly convince a victorious democracy to quietly embrace the very monsters they had just sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives to defeat. The justification for this extraordinary betrayal of public trust was born out of the immediate, terrifying vacuum of intelligence that followed the collapse of the Third Reich. As the dust settled over a pulverized Europe, the wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union instantly evaporated, replaced by a paranoid standoff across a divided continent. American military commanders quickly realized they possessed almost zero reliable human intelligence networks operating behind the newly formed Iron Curtain, leaving them entirely blind to Joseph Stalin's military capabilities and intentions. Washington was desperately searching for anyone who understood the Soviet military apparatus, and no organization on Earth had spent more time studying, infiltrating, and fighting the Red Army than Gehlen's intelligence unit, known as Foreign Armies East. Gehlen understood this dynamic perfectly, recognizing that his meticulously buried archives in the Alps were not just historical military records, but the ultimate bargaining chips for his own survival and future power. During his clandestine meetings at Fort Hunt in Virginia, Gehlen proposed a remarkably audacious arrangement that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the looming Cold War. He offered to completely resurrect his former Nazi intelligence apparatus and place it exclusively at the disposal of the United States military, providing a ready-made spy network directed squarely at Moscow. In exchange, he demanded absolute operational autonomy, massive and untraceable financial backing, and total amnesty for himself and the men he chose to recruit into this new shadow organization. American intelligence officials, blinded by their desperate need for Soviet intelligence and increasingly terrified of communist expansion, agreed to these astonishing terms with chilling bureaucratic efficiency. The resulting syndicate, officially backed by the U.S. Army, and later absorbed by the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, became known simply as the Gehlen Organization, operating out of a heavily guarded compound near Munich. The establishment of this spy network required the active, deliberate subversion of the very justice system the Allied powers were publicly championing on the world stage. American intelligence agencies began systematically shielding key operatives from the war crimes investigators at Nuremberg, erasing names from wanted lists, altering personnel files, and providing counterfeit identities to men whose hands were drenched in blood. the prosecutors working relentlessly to hold the worst offenders accountable found themselves inexplicably blocked by invisible bureaucratic walls, entirely unaware that their own government was functioning as an underground railroad for the accused. The mandate to gather intelligence had completely superseded the moral imperative to punish the perpetrators of genocide, creating a toxic environment where operational utility absolved even the most horrific historical sins. As the full scope of Gellen's recruitment drive accelerated, the horrifying reality of exactly who was being ushered into the protection of the American intelligence umbrella began to quietly take shape. The roster of the Gellen organization quickly devolved into a protected sanctuary for some of the most ruthless and fanatical instruments of the Nazi extermination apparatus. Gellen did not merely hire former staff officers or battlefield tacticians. He actively recruited senior leaders from the SS, the Gestapo, and the infamous Einsatzgruppen death squads that had systematically murdered millions across Eastern Europe. Men like Franz Six, a convicted war criminal, who had directly commanded a mobile killing unit tasked with annihilating Jewish populations in the Soviet Union, were quietly placed on the payroll and tasked with directing counterintelligence agents. Another recruit, Emil Augsburg, an SS officer intimately involved in the planning of the final solution, was considered an expert on Soviet affairs, and was deemed entirely too useful to be left to the mercy of a hangman's noose. The American intelligence community was not ignorant of these men's atrocious pasts. Rather, they documented their horrifying crimes in classified files, while simultaneously issuing their paychecks and aggressively protecting them from extradition. This dark alliance required a vast and complex cover-up operation to ensure that the American public and international allies never discovered the identities of these newly minted Cold War assets. The CIA and its military predecessors utilized clandestine ratlins, escape routes originally designed to help downed Allied pilots, to smuggle wanted war criminals out of the reach of international tribunals and into safe houses across Europe and South America. When Allied investigators grew too close to exposing a protected asset, American handlers would abruptly relocate the operative, falsify their death records, or aggressively classify their files under the impenetrable banner of national security. The sheer scale of the deception transformed the intelligence agencies into active accomplices in the evasion of justice, committing immense resources to shelter men who had orchestrated the darkest chapter in modern human history. The justification repeated behind closed doors was that the existential threat of communism necessitated a temporary suspension of morality, a Faustian bargain where the ends supposedly justified the horrific means. However, the central premise holding this corrupt foundation together, the supposedly unmatched brilliance and necessity of Gellen's Soviet intelligence, was slowly beginning to reveal profound and dangerous structural cracks. American analysts evaluating the reports flowing out of the Munich compound started noticing alarming patterns of exaggeration, circular reporting, and occasionally outright fabrication designed to keep Washington in a perpetual state of fear. Gellen fundamentally understood that his organization's funding, protection, and political survival relied entirely on the perceived imminence of a Soviet attack, giving him every incentive to inflate troop movements and invent entirely fictional communist conspiracies. This created a perilous feedback loop where the United States was basing its nuclear strategy and geopolitical maneuvering on deliberately skewed data provided by former fascists. with a vested interest in provoking a conflict between the superpowers. As the Cold War intensified, a terrifying question began to echo through the highest levels of the American government regarding who was actually manipulating whom in this twisted geopolitical arrangement. The ultimate catastrophe of the Gehlen Organization was not just a profound moral failure, but a devastating operational disaster that severely compromised Western security for more than a decade. It was eventually uncovered that the KGB had successfully penetrated Gehlen's network from its very inception, exploiting the vulnerabilities of former Nazis who were highly susceptible to blackmail or ideological flipping. The most catastrophic breach came from Heinz Felf, a former SS officer recruited by Gehlen to run counterintelligence against the Soviets, who was actually operating as a heavily embedded double agent for Moscow. For 10 years, Felf systematically handed over the identities of hundreds of CIA operatives, compromised countless covert missions, and ensured that almost every piece of intelligence filtering through the Gehlen Organization was carefully curated by the KGB. The American intelligence community had surrendered its moral high ground, shielded architects of the Holocaust, and subverted international justice, all to protect a spy network that was ultimately functioning as an operational arm of Soviet intelligence. The fallout from this catastrophic security failure was quietly buried under layers of classification, as acknowledging the truth would have destroyed the credibility of the entire Western intelligence apparatus. The CIA found itself trapped in a nightmare of its own design, unable to publicly prosecute the Soviet moles within the Gehlen Organization without simultaneously admitting that they had been funding and protecting high-ranking Nazi war criminals. Consequently, many of the men who had overseen the extermination camps and death squads were allowed to retire quietly on government pensions, living out their days in comfortable anonymity while the true victims of their wartime atrocities remained unavenged. The intelligence supposedly essential to the survival of the free world had proven to be a carefully orchestrated illusion, leaving behind a legacy of poisoned archives, betrayed agents, and a profound institutional rot. The historical record confirms that the United States government actively chose to embrace the absolute worst of humanity in pursuit of security, only to discover that they had purchased nothing but their own systemic compromise. When we look back at the desperate, paranoid decisions made in the shadows of the early Cold War, we are forced to confront an incredibly uncomfortable reality about how easily democratic ideals can be discarded in the name of national defense. If the institutions sworn to protect a free society are willing to actively shield the perpetrators of genocide to gain a perceived tactical advantage, we have to ask ourselves what actual values are left to defend. Does the survival of a state ever truly justify the complete abandonment of the justice it claims to represent? Or does that compromise inevitably rot the system from the inside out? Let us know down in the comments where you draw the line between necessary intelligence gathering and unforgivable moral compromise. If you want to keep digging into the histories that institutions have tried to bury forever, make sure you subscribe and join us for the next investigation.